The Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, all dead. Each one followed a precise 7-stage death sequence. The US dollar completed stage 5 inches 2020. Stage 6 has already begun. Let me show you the pattern. What you're about to learn is not speculation. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a mathematical framework that has repeated itself 4 times across 6 centuries. You will understand exactly where the US dollar stands in this cycle, why stage 6 is the point of no return, and what happens when stage 7 arrives. Channel opening line here. Let's begin with a question. Why do reserve currencies die? The answer lies in a structural trap built into the system itself, a trap so predictable that economists have a name for it, the Triffin dilemma. Named after Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, who warned the US Congress in 1960 that the dollar was destined to collapse under the weight of its own success. He was right, but the dilemma didn't start with the dollar. It started centuries ago with the Portuguese real. One, Portugal controlled the spice trade. Their ships ruled the Indian Ocean. Their currency, the real, became the world's first global reserve currency. By 1580, it was worthless. 2. The Dutch East India Company dominated global commerce. The guilder became the reserve currency of choice. By 1780, it was gone. 3. Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the world's naval superpower. The pound sterling became the backbone of international trade. By 1944, it was replaced. 3. The United States, holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and facing no competition after World War II, established the dollar as the global reserve currency through the Bretton Woods Agreement. 81 years later, in 2025, the dollar is showing every symptom of terminal decline. 4 currencies, 4 collapses, 7 identical stages every single time. Here's the critical insight. These collapses are not caused by war, revolution, or external shocks. They are caused by the internal mechanics of being a reserve currency. It's a structural death sentence. Let me show you how it works. The pattern is mathematical. It is deterministic, and it has never been broken. Not once in 600 years. Every reserve currency that has ever existed has followed this exact sequence, and the US dollar is no exception. Every reserve currency begins with overwhelming military power. Not economic theory, not diplomacy, raw, unchallengeable force. Portugal in 1500 controlled the sea routes to Asia. They didn't negotiate access, they took it. Their caravels were faster, their cannons more powerful, their navigators more skilled than anyone else on Earth. They controlled the Strait of Malacca. They controlled the Cape of Good Hope. They controlled the Spice Islands of Indonesia. If you wanted pepper, cloves, or cinnamon, you paid the Portuguese. In their currency, the Dutch in 1600 had more firepower than most European nations. The Dutch East India Company operated as a state within a state. It had its own army, its own navy, its own currency. It waged wars in Asia without consulting Amsterdam. It signed treaties. It built forts. It monopolized trade routes from Jakarta to Japan. And the guilder became the global standard because Dutch ships enforced it. Britain in 1815 had a navy larger than the next 3 powers combined. After defeating Napoleon, Britain controlled every major shipping lane on the planet. The Royal Navy patrolled the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea. No cargo moved without British consent, and every cargo that moved was priced in pounds. The United States in 1945 had nuclear weapons and no rival. American forces occupied Japan and Germany. The British Empire was bankrupt. The Soviet Union was devastated. France was rebuilding from rubble. China was in civil war. America faced no competition. The US Navy controlled every ocean. The US Air Force controlled every sky. And the Bretton Woods Agreement made the dollar the official reserve currency because no one had the power to object. Military dominance creates trade route control. Trade route control creates wealth accumulation. Wealth accumulation creates currency demand. This is stage one. This is the foundation. Without military power, there is no reserve currency. History has no exceptions. But military dominance is expensive. Fleets decay, bases cost money, rivals emerge, and so the cycle moves forward. Once you control the trade routes, wealth flows in. This is stage two, the golden age. The reserve currency nation runs enormous trade surpluses. They export more than they import. They accumulate gold, silver, capital. They become rich, extraordinarily rich. Portugal in the 1500s extracted spices, slaves, and gold from 3 continents. Lisbon became the wealthiest city in Europe. Portuguese merchants controlled the price of pepper across the continent. A single successful voyage to India could return profits of 300%. The royal treasury overflowed. Portugal was untouchable. The Dutch in the 1600s controlled textiles, timber, and Asian goods. Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602, was the first of its kind. Dutch merchants financed kings. They funded wars. They set interest rates for half of Europe. The guilder was gold. Literally, every guilder coin was backed by real silver, and the world trusted it. Britain, in the 1800s, ran a trade surplus for decades, exporting manufactured goods across the empire. British factories produced steel, textiles, machinery, and shipped it to India, Africa, Australia, Canada. Raw materials flowed into London, finished goods flowed out. The trade balance was overwhelmingly positive. Britain accumulated wealth at a rate never seen before in human history. The United States ran massive trade surpluses from 1,945 to 1,970. American factories produced half the world's manufactured goods. American cars, American steel, American electronics dominated global markets. Europe was rebuilding. Asia was industrializing. Everyone needed American products. Dollars flowed out, but real goods flowed in even faster. The US accumulated wealth at a historic rate. This is the peak. This is the illusion of permanence. Every reserve currency believes it will last forever at this stage. Economists write papers about the new normal. Politicians declare an American century, or a British century, or a Dutch golden age. But none of them do, because here's the trap. The more successful you are, the more expensive your currency becomes. Your goods get pricier, your labor costs rise, your exports slow down, foreign competitors emerge. And the surplus turns into a deficit, always. Portugal's trade surplus collapsed in the 1,550 seconds when Spain began extracting silver from South America. The Dutch trade surplus collapsed in the 1700s when Britain industrialized. Britain's trade surplus collapsed after World War I when the US became the manufacturing hub. And the US trade surplus collapsed in 1971 when Japan and Germany rebuilt their industries. The transition from stage 2 to stage 3 is subtle. It happens at the peak of power, and no one sees it coming. At the peak of trade dominance, the reserve currency status becomes official. Treaties are signed, international agreements are made, the currency is formally recognized as the medium of global commerce. This is the moment of maximum confidence. This is when the currency is codified into the architecture of international trade. For Portugal, this happened through treaties with Asian kingdoms and European powers. The Portuguese real was accepted from Goa to Macau, from Lisbon to Brazil. It was the first truly global currency. For the Dutch, it was the Amsterdam Exchange Bank in 1609. The bank issued standardized receipts backed by precious metals. These receipts became the de facto international payment system. The guilder was trusted everywhere. For Britain, it was the Gold Standard Act of 1844. The British pound was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, and the world followed. By 1870, most of the industrialized world had adopted the gold standard with the pound as the anchor. London became the center of global finance. For the United States, it was Bretton Woods in 1944. 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire and agreed the dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar became the official reserve currency of the world. The International Monetary Fund was created to manage the system. The World Bank was created to finance reconstruction. Everything was denominated in dollars. This moment, the formalization, is the peak. It feels like victory. It feels like the natural order of things. It is actually the beginning of the end. Because once your currency is the global reserve, the Triffin dilemma activates. You must supply the world with your currency. But to do that, you must run trade deficits. You must import more than you export. You must send your currency abroad. And in doing so, you hollow out your own economy. Robert Triffin explained this to Congress in 1960. He told them the dollar could not survive as a reserve currency under the Bretton Woods system. He said the contradiction was mathematical. He said the system would collapse within a decade. He was ignored. 11 years later, on the 15th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Bretton Woods was dead. Triffin was right. The formalization of reserve status is not a triumph. It is a timer. It starts the countdown to collapse. Stage 4 is where the cancer begins. The reserve currency nation stops producing and starts consuming. Trade surpluses turn into trade deficits, permanently. Portugal began importing more than it exported by the 1,570 seconds. Spanish silver flooded European markets, and Portuguese goods became uncompetitive. Portugal started buying grain from Northern Europe, textiles from Italy, and luxuries from Asia. The trade balance flipped. It never recovered. The Dutch did the same by the 1700s. As Britain industrialized, Dutch manufacturing declined. The Netherlands became a financial hub, but it stopped making things. It imported manufactured goods and exported capital. The trade deficit grew. The guilder weakened. Britain's trade balance collapsed after World War I. British factories couldn't compete with American mass production. British steel, British textiles, British machinery were too expensive. The empire still existed, but the trade surplus was gone. Britain became a net importer, permanently. The United States entered permanent trade deficit in 1971. That year, for the first time since World War II, America imported more than it exported. It has never recovered. Not once in the last 54 years has the US run a sustained trade surplus. Let me give you the numbers. In 1970, the US trade deficit was effectively zero. By 1980, it was $70 billion. By 2000, it was $400 billion. By 2020, it was over $900 billion. In 2024, it's approaching $1 trillion annually. That's $1 trillion of goods flowing into the United States every year that are not paid for with exports. They are paid for with dollars, printed dollars. This is not a recession. This is not a policy failure. This is the mathematical consequence of being a reserve currency. Why does this happen? Because the world needs dollars to trade. Oil is priced in dollars. Commodities are priced in dollars. International debt is priced in dollars. To get those dollars, other nations must sell goods to America. And America must buy those goods. The deficit is not optional, it's structural. It's built into the system. But deficits must be financed. And that brings us to stage 5. When you run deficits, you have two options: borrow or print. The reserve currency nation does both. But eventually, borrowing becomes impossible. The debt becomes too large. Interest payments consume the budget, and so the nation prints. It creates money out of thin air to pay for goods it no longer produces. Portugal debased its coinage in the 1,570 seconds, mixing copper with silver. The real lost value. Merchants stopped accepting it. trade shifted to Spanish silver dollars. The Dutch inflated their money supply in the 1700s to fund wars against France and Britain. The guilder lost purchasing power. By the 1782, Dutch merchants preferred British pounds. Britain printed money after World War I to pay debts and fund social programs. The pound lost a third of its value between 1920 and 1925. By 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard entirely. The pound was no longer backed by anything. The United States began Stage 5 inches 2008. That year, the Federal Reserve launched quantitative easing, a program to purchase government bonds and mortgage-backed securities by creating new dollars out of thin air. They printed $800 billion in the first round, then another $600 billion in 2010, then another $800 billion in 2012. The program was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. By 2020, money printing went into overdrive. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve printed $4.7 trillion in 18 months. $4.7 trillion. That's more than the entire US money supply in 2008. The M2 money supply, which includes cash, checking accounts, and savings accounts, increased by 40% in 2 years. Let me put that in perspective. In 1980, the US monetary base was $140 billion. In 2000, it was $600 billion. In 2020, it was $5 trillion. In 2025, it's over $8 trillion. The money supply has increased by 57 times in 45 years. This is monetary debasement. This is inflation by design. And it's the signature of Stage 5. Every reserve currency does this. Every single one. Because the alternative is default. And default is political suicide. But here's the critical point. Money printing works until it doesn't. For a reserve currency, you can print for years, even decades, because the world absorbs your inflation. Foreign central banks hold your currency. Foreign businesses trade in your currency. They take the hit. Your inflation becomes their problem. But eventually, they notice. And when they notice, they move to Stage 6. Stage 6 is the point of no return. This is where the world stops trusting the reserve currency and begins looking for alternatives, not because of war, not because of sanctions, because of mathematics, because holding a depreciating asset is a bad investment. For Portugal, this happened in the 1,570 seconds when Spanish silver became more trusted. Merchants in Lisbon started pricing goods in Spanish reals. The Portuguese real became a secondary currency in its own country. For the Dutch, it was the 1,780 seconds when British pounds became dominant. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War destroyed Dutch naval power. British trade routes replaced Dutch ones. The guilder lost relevance. For Britain, it was the 1,940 seconds when the dollar replaced the pound. After World War II, Britain was broke. It owed billions to the United States. It could no longer defend the empire. And in 1944, at Bretton Woods, Britain agreed to make the dollar the global reserve. The pound was dethroned. For the United States, Stage 6 began in the early 2020 seconds. Here's the evidence. In 2000, the US dollar represented 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2010, it was 62%. By 2020, it was 59%. In 2024, it's 58%. The dollar is losing share every single year. Where is that money going? Gold, the euro, the Chinese yuan. Central banks are diversifying away from dollars at the fastest rate in history. China and Russia have reduced their dollar holdings by over 40% since 2018. The People's Bank of China sold over $300 billion in US Treasury bonds between 2016 and 2024. Russia dumped nearly all of its Treasury holdings after 2014. India is buying oil from Russia in rupees, not dollars. Saudi Arabia is discussing yuan-based oil contracts with China. Brazil and Argentina are exploring a common currency. The United Arab Emirates is accepting yuan for oil payments. Even US allies are hedging. France repatriated its gold reserves from New York in 2022. Germany did the same in 2020. Poland moved 400 tons of gold back to Warsaw. But stage 6 is not a collapse. It's a slow bleed. The dollar doesn't disappear overnight. It loses relevance gradually, year by year, transaction by transaction. And during this phase, the reserve currency nation makes desperate moves to maintain dominance. Sanctions, trade wars, military interventions, all of it accelerates the transition to stage 7. Stage 7 is the endgame. A new currency rises through market adoption, and the old reserve currency is replaced. Not by war, not by decree, by choice. Portugal's real was replaced by the Spanish silver dollar in the 1600s. Spain had the gold, Spain had the trade routes, Spain had the military. The real faded into irrelevance. The Dutch guilder was replaced by the British pound in the 1800s. Britain had the navy, Britain had the factories, Britain had the empire. The guilder became a regional currency. The British pound was replaced by the US dollar in 1944. America had the gold, America had the military, America had the industrial base. The pound lost reserve status, and Britain entered a decade of austerity. What replaces the dollar? We don't know yet. But history gives us clues. The replacement currency always comes from the nation with the largest trade surplus. It always comes from the nation with the most trusted assets. It always comes from the nation with the strongest military capable of enforcing trade routes. Right now, China is the world's largest exporter. China holds the largest gold reserves outside the US. China is building a yuan-based payment system called CIPS to rival SWIFT. China has the world's largest navy by ship count. The pattern fits. But it might not be the yuan. It could be a basket of currencies managed by the IMF. It could be a commodity-backed digital currency. It could be a return to gold. The exact replacement doesn't matter. What matters is that the dollar will be replaced. When will it happen? Based on historical timelines, stage 7 occurs 10 to 20 years after stage 6 begins. Stage 6 began around 2020. That puts stage 7 between 2030 and 2040. And here's what we know for certain. The transition will be chaotic. When the British pound lost reserve status, Britain experienced a decade of austerity, rationing, and economic collapse. The empire dissolved. Living standards fell. Unemployment spiked. Savings were destroyed. When reserve currencies die, they don't go quietly. Inflation spikes. Debt becomes unpayable. Imports become unaffordable. Governments make desperate moves. Capital controls, price controls, wealth taxes, and none of it works. The US dollar will follow the same path. Not because of policy failure, not because of corruption, because of mathematics, because of the structural trap built into the reserve currency system. So here's where we are. The US dollar achieved reserve currency status in 1944. It ran massive trade surpluses until 1971. It entered permanent trade deficits in 1971. It began money printing in 2008. It accelerated debasement in 2020. It is now losing global reserve share in 2025. This is not a prediction, this is pattern recognition. 4 reserve currencies have died following this exact sequence. The Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound. Each one believed it would last forever. Each one followed the same 7 stages. The dollar is the 5th, and the cycle is playing out in real time. The question is not if, the question is when. And the answer, based on historical timelines, is within the next 10 to 20 years. So here's my question for you. Knowing this pattern, what do you do with your wealth? Do you hold dollars? Do you diversify into gold, commodities, or foreign currencies? Do you prepare for the transition, or do you ignore the warning signs? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want to understand the mechanisms behind financial collapses, subscribe and hit the bell, because the next videos will break down exactly how stage 7 unfolds and what comes after. Thanks for watching.